Welcome to the Barakat Trust podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Barakat Trust. My name is Thomas Adkins, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Keelan Overton, who, as a grantee of the Barakat Trust and art historian of the Iranian world, is here to talk to us today about her project, the Shrine of Emamzadeh Yahya in Varamin, a town south of Tehran. I'm very glad to have you join us today, Keelan.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And so before we launch into the project and the shrine itself, just going to do a brief introduction about Keelan. So Keelan is an art historian trained at Williams College and UCLA, from where she received her PhD in 2011. And she's published on links between Iran and the Deccan in India, which came out in 2020, after which she moved to this project that we're working on or talking about today, Emamzadeh Yahya, which has been going, I believe, since 2021, amongst your teaching activities in the universities of the area around in Southern California. And so I just want to launch straight into the project and the shrine, because I feel like we have two elements going on here. We have the shrine, Emamzadeh Yahya, and the project that you've been working on, for which I should say the Barakat Trust contributed to its funding in 2024 when Keelan received one of our A3 major awards. And we've been delighted to, since 2024, we've been delighted to see how the project has come along, how it's grown, how it's progressed. And so let's launch in, Keelan. What is the Shrine of Emamzadeh Yahya? Where is Varamin? What's Varamin? Just the real basics, if you could start us off.
Sure. So this is the Shrine of Emamzadeh Yahya. So this is Yahya ibn Ali. He is a descendant of Imam Hassan, 6th generation. So we know he dies or is martyred in 255, 256, or 869, 870, because it's during the very short reign of the 14th Abbasid Caliph. And what's interesting about Yahya ibn Ali, or Emamzadeh Yahya, which is, of course, the name of the shrine as well, is that he's relatively well recorded in sources, not exactly contemporary to his life, but shortly thereafter, so within about 100 years. Mm-hmm. And one of the main questions that I had going into this project was this question: who exactly was Yahya ibn Ali? Who is Emamzadeh Yahya? What are our sources for understanding him? How, and even broadly speaking, how does an Emamzadeh become an Emamzadeh with a capital E?
Yes.
What are our sources for these descendants of Imam Hussein, Imam Ali, Imam Hassan? So that was the central question at the beginning. And so the answers I'm going to give you to these questions actually come from a contributor. This is Ahmad Khomeiyar. And early on in the project, I had this question, and I knew I wanted the saint himself to be represented in our first gallery, our third gallery, the ritual gallery. And Hossein Nahai recommended Ahmad. And you can see his essay in the ritual gallery. It's the third thumbnail, and he goes into some of these sources that document him. So I'm summarizing his research here, but basically we have sources from about the 960s onwards who are recording him as having been martyred during the reign of this particular caliph, and his burial place, his mashad, being in either Ray or Varamin, which at the time could have been one and the same, because these are only about 25 minutes apart.
Right, I see.
And there's some references to his father. There's some suggestion of maybe he was buried with his father. But basically, we have this idea of a mashad in a 10th century source for this Yahya ibn Ali. And his genealogy is given very precisely. And so then the question becomes, what's our next batch of sources? So after these genealogies, we then get into the 13th century. And the shrine itself, the shrine of Emamzadeh Yahya, becomes a source, because we have some dated materials in the shrine, including the cenotaph.
And so this is when the 13th century is roughly when the shrine is built, or in some form.
Exactly. In some form is a great phrase because this is a big ambiguity. So, like I said, we think we have a Mashhad recorded in 10th century sources. We have some suggestion of this being in Varamin. And then we can't say exactly when a structure was built. As you might know, as it goes with many tombs, there are processes of accretion, and they might start small as one chamber and grow and grow. What
Yeah.
we know for sure is that by the 1260s, say, we have what can be described as a complex.
Right.
What exactly it was before, we don't know. So the main structure of this complex is in Persian, the Gonbad Khane, the main tomb of the saint.
Mm.
And we know that there was also an adjacent structure with a conical roof. There was a monumental entrance portal. We know this from an 1881 photograph by the French traveler Jean Dieulafoy. So we have this sense of this medieval complex by the 1260s, and the dated inscriptions within the tomb in the luster tile work now displaced and in the stucco inscription, more importantly in situ, range from the early 1260s to 1307. And these sources are good and leave a little to be desired. So, for example, Emamzadeh Yahya's genealogy is not spelled out on the tombstone, which is now in the Hermitage, the cover of the tombstone. In the stucco inscription, we're very lucky to have the name of the patron, which is written out in great detail, Fakhruddin Hassan, and it's dated 707 or 1307. So we know the name of the patron, and by this time we know a lot more about what is Varamin. So that can go into your second part of your question.
Yeah.
We know that Varamin at this time is a provincial capital of the Ilkhanid court, which is based in the northwest. We know that it is a medieval city. It has a Masjid Jame, this congregational mosque that still stands today. It's one of the most important congregational mosques of the Ilkhanid period in Iran. And we know that this particular family, the Hosseini Varaminis, are very important not only as patrons, as this preeminent Shi'i family, but also as people who wish to be buried in tombs. And so you have this blossoming of many Emamzadehs, especially for this family. But we also have tombs in Varamin at this time that are the tombs of Sufi saints, for example. So I mentioned early on that Ahmad Khameyar's essay really helps us understand Yahya ibn Ali, who he is. And I think I'm so pleased to have his essay and his participation because the saint has kind of been lost in art historical discourse and art historical or architectural discourse. We tend to focus on the site as a medieval monument of the Ilkhanid period, but we really haven't talked about the saint. And the saint is what keeps it alive, right?
Until today.
His activation. Exactly, his activation, people's devotion to him. Over 7 centuries, it is he that has kept the site alive. It is Barakat that has drawn people there, that has called them to the shrine. Another essay within the website that is very important for helping people to understand the site as a destination of ziyarat, as a religious site, as a tomb, is the essay by Nazanin Shahidi Marnani. And this is in the People Gallery. And this is on the Yadagari, or the small inscriptions that pilgrims inscribed over the centuries on the stucco inscription that I just mentioned. So you have this stucco inscription, this data, this historical source wrapping you around the tomb, but then you have this other layer of the Yadagari written on the surface of those letters. So you can imagine the pilgrims writing their tiny little inscriptions, the size of our handwriting really, on these letters, documenting their ziyarat. And the earliest one that survives is, I think, within 50 years, around 1350, and it goes up through the recent 20th century, including one on the day of Ashura in the 19-teens, around the same exact time that the tiles, a lot of the tiles, including the tombstone of the cenotaph, are being sent from Paris to St. Petersburg. So, just sit on that for a second. You have a pilgrim going to the shrine on Ashura, writing his inscription to memorialize that visit. At the same time, tiles are being sold from Paris to St. Petersburg. It's quite baffling to think of these contemporary disconnects. And that's kind of a leitmotif of this project, these disconnects.
Yeah.
And this disconnect between the life of the shrine and then the life of its tiles outside of museums. And for so long, these have been two different narratives, the site and the tiles. And one of the principal goals of this project is, of course, to unite the two in a balanced way and to solve these two really profound disconnects that I identified early on, which are highlighted in my introduction, but I'll say again here. The first is that the majority of people who use the shrine, who live in the neighborhood, the community, they will not be able to go see the shrine's tiles or archives in foreign museums. And then
outside
on the
of
flip
Iran.
side, exactly. And because a lot of the archives are still in Iran, but most of the tiles are outside of Iran. So you have this disconnect. And then on the flip side, the majority of people who consume the tiles in museums, at the V&A, at the British Museum, many places in London, but everywhere, they are truly everywhere, from the Pacific Ocean in Hawaii to the Hermitage to Doha, etc. The majority of those people are not going to be able to go visit the shrine. And very early on in this project, I counted myself lucky to have been one of those very lucky people to have kind of experienced both worlds.
Yeah.
And so this website tries to bridge those worlds for everybody.
Yeah.
I'm going off on a tangent here, but I think I've given you
No, but
the basics of the saint and the basics of the place.
I mean, I think you raise an important point about this disconnect of audiences, interested people, scholars, community, users, stakeholders, whichever words we want to use to describe all of these different types of people involved. And these two things, you've very beautifully summed up the site, whether beginning with Yahya as a historical figure, a real figure, as you mentioned in the essay of Ahmad becoming how one becomes a saint or Emamzadeh. And then the shrine that comes up around him in the town of Varamin. And then you've mentioned a bit about the project, which maybe I can just give an extremely brief introduction before asking my next question, is a website, as has already been alluded to, on which there are a big collection of resources, essays, video essays, interviews, photos, maps. And I think this is something that you're going to be emphasizing, Keelan. This is also a collaboration. Okay, this podcast is you and I talking, but there are many, many people involved in this project. And this is sort of the second part of what this podcast is about, bringing these two together, as you've said. The shrine around the figure of Emamzadeh and your project, which is just one part of its longer story. So I want to ask really, you've mentioned that you visited the shrine. I'm going to guess that was before Corona, before 2020 and the pandemic. And so my question is, why did you choose this shrine? Why did you choose this project? I mean, you've already maybe mentioned or answered that second question in part. Yeah, so how was this project conceived and why did you decide on this form?
Yes, and thank you for the question, and thank you for also mentioning that you and I are talking and that this is a huge collaboration, right? So I'm speaking today on behalf of the project, and I'm trying to paint the full picture of the many parts and contributors to the project. At the same time, it is a very personal project to me. So my answer to your question is going to be quite personal because it is a personal academic journey. It's a personal academic journey between the site, between my museum experience, and between my publishing experience. So I really like the way that how you've divided this approach to our conversation between the shrine itself and the project. And the project for me began the day I walked into the shrine. It was April 2018, and that was by then my fourth trip to Iran. I've been very lucky to go to Iran on tourist visas as a lecturer on tours organized by museums. And so I had always wanted to go to this shrine because the first place that I had extensive curatorial experience was the place that preserved its mihrab.
I see.
So for me, this project, it goes back to, gosh, I guess my mid-20s. I was at Williams College and I got my first curatorial internship at Shangri-La in Honolulu as an MA student between my first and second years. And so that's
As
the first time
far,
I saw the mihrab. Sorry?
I was going to say, as far as possibly can be from the original site.
As far as possibly can be, absolutely. So, I'm in Hawaii in 2003. I'm in the middle of pursuing a master's degree, and I haven't been to Iran yet. And long story short, I had many iterations of work at Shangri-La, from a curatorial summer intern to an assistant curator after my master's to an assistant to the textile conservator. And then finally, after my PhD in 2011, I had a job. I got the job there while I was writing a dissertation, which is also a very lucky thing. So I went back in 2011. At that point, I'd been to Iran once. I hadn't been to Varamin. And now I'm confronted with this mihrab, which I know really nothing about. I've been lucky to hear a couple talks by Sheila Blair, who was in the midst of publishing. But basically, what I do remember is feeling very uncomfortable with being the curator in charge of this mihrab, and being very uncomfortable with my lack of knowledge, being very uncomfortable with it being there. Then I kind of went into another job at a museum at LACMA. I encountered one of the star tiles from the shrine there. I started seeing these tiles more and more as I developed into my profession as a curator. And then at a certain point, I left museum curation. I had two great jobs, but it wasn't my cup of chai at the end of the day for some reasons that are really confronted exactly in this website. Both the museological interventions and the publishing interventions and the research interventions, they all stem from my own experiences, which are, of course, both positive and negative. Anyway, so since then, I had first gone to some shrines in Guam. I'd gone to the shrine at Natanz, which you go into that and it's like an open crime scene. It's like the robbing of the tiles happened yesterday. The thefts are on full view. It's extremely raw. And that, I think, maybe got the wheels turning at first, like this disconnect, again, between this beautiful outward facade and this crime on the inside, which would not be obvious unless you walked into the tomb and you really looked at it. And so I went first with my colleague, national guide, Mojgan Atarzadeh, who's a dear friend. And we kind of, quote unquote, scoped the site. We kind of approached the site and some other sites through the lens of, can this work to bring a tour group of 8 people or so? And will the sites want us to be there? Is this all fine? So we did that, and we went on a quiet day. I think there was maybe a couple people in the tomb. The Motevalid was there, the Khadem, and I walked in the door. I don't know if I went to the right or the left. It is divided by gender, but it can be very fluid depending on the day. I just walked around freely, and within 3 seconds of walking into the tomb, you're facing the mihrab at the back on the Qibla wall. And it is an enormous gaping void. And how would I describe it? Maybe like a gut punch, and a gut punch for someone who's not even Iranian, who's not even a Shi'i Muslim, but someone who had such a reaction and this feeling of disconnect, like, what have I seen in Hawaii? And then what is this? And how do we bridge these spaces? So there's a lot of powerful dynamics there. And I'm taking a long time to answer your question, but basically I got back. I started to notice some things. By now, the digital life is on my radar. I saw a blog written by someone who had gone to Shangri-La posing in a kind of provocative way in front of the mihrab, which just did not sit well with me. So I could start to see that there's all this misinformation or misinterpretation or
Yeah.
just lack of knowledge, lack of resources between all these contexts. And the contexts are not just the shrine itself and the museum, but also the archive. So you have a physical site, you have at least 50 museums worldwide that preserve the tiles, and then you have many institutions that preserve the archives that are essential for recreating the over 700-year history of this shrine. So I'm talking about archives in Iran, at Majlis, at Malik, at within the Miras, very important restoration archives within the Varamin Miras, the Cultural Heritage Organization. Outside of Iran, I'm referring to very important archives that document the acquisitions of the tiles, especially at places like the V&A, for example, which has been so open with their archive. And places like the Louvre have the Yeda and André Godard archive, which includes an incredibly important photography of the site, because you can't really tell a over 700-year history of this place without the photographs and the
Yeah.
text that document
Yeah.
that. So our website brings together some extremely important 19th century sources. It brings together very, very important photographs of the site. That's also a feature in the building gallery called the photo timeline. It brings together the restoration documents in the Miras. That's an essay by Zahra Khodemi in the People Gallery under preservationists. So we're kind of bringing the archive, the site itself, and the tiles back together. Back to the evolution of the project, and I'm going to say this very quickly, is but I think it's important to share the evolution of the project in case it's helpful to anyone else, because I learned so many lessons. So I come back in 2018. I know there's something to be done here. I start to thinking about writing something, and at that point, Kimio Maliki says, "Oh, I just went on Muharram in 2019," and she tells me her experience, and we think, "Okay, let's write an article together. Let's do this."
Yeah.
In the piece, I hinted at what was really a dream, which was to have true, sustained observational fieldwork conducted at the site, and that dream came true in this project thanks to Mariam Rafainejad and her 6 months of work, and also Jabal Rahmani, who did a lot of work in Varamin at different sites for the project as well. Immediately after that came out, I received a hard copy version of Iran-Deccan, which was a wonderful edited volume project, but I knew that wasn't the way to go for this. This had to be a website, this had to be an online exhibition. So there was no doubt about the fact that this had to be a digital project because our primary audiences were people in Iran, and we needed a lot of Persian, and we needed accessibility on many, many different levels that you could only achieve online. And then I started experimenting with different ways of sharing the research. I was ready to go. Let's make the website. So then the question becomes, what do you make it in? Who hosts it? And I was encouraged to find an institutional host. And ultimately, Hamsin and the University of Michigan agreed to host the project as an independent project within their own platform, but also given its own distinct URL. And then it was just full speed ahead from March 2003 onward to create the website and creating a publication that goes inside that website. And the publication isn't something that you can put in a single box. It's an edited volume, it's an exhibition catalog, it's a multimedia production, it's a lot of different things. It's sort of multi-genre. And then to the funding question, which was always a struggle throughout the project, it really clicked in the spring of 2024, where I got 3 more grants. By that time I had 2, and Barakat was one of the 3 that came in spring 2024 at a critical moment. And it was critical because I needed to hire more people to work on the project, and I needed more funding to achieve the goals. And for 5 months only, we pushed and we created the website. I had been editing papers and essays for 4 years by then, but we got it all in these 4 or 5 months. We created a mirrored website in Persian. We finished at least 15 to 20 translations. It was a wonderful team. And then it launched in January 2025. So that's kind of how the project evolved. And since then, we've been adding features that have always been marked coming soon.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was curated. Every gallery is a curation. It's a curation of knowledge, right? So you'll see 6 thumbnails, and maybe the 6th thumbnail, the 5th, the last one in the gallery might not be done. It might say coming soon, but it was always conceived to be there, and things just took a long time. Yesterday, I finished editing a scientific analysis essay by 4 authors, which will be the final piece in the Luster Gallery. And then I can speak later about some other final pieces.
Yeah. So clearly, Keelan, I mean, I think if there's one thing that comes out of the way you talk about this project and how it happened, how it's progressed, how it is today, is that it's a very personal one. And I don't mean personal just in terms of what it means to you, but in terms of this involves a lot of persons or a lot of people. You've mentioned countless names that I can't keep track of people who've contributed. And as we've mentioned slightly earlier in the episode about the importance of the collaboration. However, obviously we're sat here, we're recording, it's late May 2026, and we can't ignore the clouds that hangs over us, which is the war in Iran. And I was later in contact with Keelan and said an interesting comment, which Keelan pointed out I'm not the only one to have made, but nevertheless made, which is that this project must feel more important now, given the war, to which you had a response that I'm sure you'd be interested to express here. And so my question really is, given this cloud of the war that still hangs over Iran and has undoubtedly affected the people with whom you've collaborated extensively and personally on this project, what does it mean, just even in the basics of no internet? This is an internet site in a country where for months there was no internet.
Yes, thank you for the very important question. On the internet point, internet connectivity is the only reason this project has happened.
Mm.
So this project presents the work of 10 people who did original scholarship on Emamzadeh Yahya and Varamin, 8 of whom are in Iran.
Yeah.
So it simply would not exist without these collaborations. I won't rattle off all the names again, but they know who they are. And internet was key. And I wanted to say to the audience that it was not hard to collaborate. We could collaborate on Telegram. We could send voice message memos. Sometimes we used WhatsApp. Sometimes we talked. We often used Google Meet. Zoom would require a VPN, but it was doable. I'm not sure of the circumstance now, but before the war, the website was accessible in Iran even without a VPN. You know, the internet blackout is a humanitarian crisis in my view, but now is not the time to ask people about the project, really, or to continue work. It's just really, I'm just asking people how they're doing. But to get granular to the project itself, we did have 2 pieces remaining, and I hope we can finish them. One of the most positive, hopeful things, just exciting things that I had heard about was that students in the Gulbar group in Tehran were planning an event at the site. They were planning a field trip.
Obviously, things change every day, so it's not easy, and especially not easy for people you've collaborated with in Iran. But I want to move to a slightly, maybe a more cheerful topic, which is I just want to zoom in and ask you to talk briefly about your favorite part of the website. Maybe it's an essay or a film. I'd just like you to tell me a bit and tell the audience about what is this? Why is it your favorite? What does it talk about? And who wrote it?
This is a really difficult question to answer for several reasons. One, because we have over 70 contributions in the website, and two, because I was an editor and publisher, I think, of about 40 people. So it's hard to play favorites, but I can at least give you categories of favorites. The first category includes two essays that were very important to me as I was working on the chronological history of the shrine with Hossein Nakhai. That's an essay in the building gallery in which we attempted a diachronic history of the shrine from the 1220s to 2024. And the two essays that really kept luring me back were two essays in the People Gallery. And the first is by Mariam Rafeinejad, and the second is by Nazanin Shahidi Marnani. And both of these essays are in Persian, then in English translation, and together they help us to understand the use of the shrine, its meaning to its constituents, to its communities over 7 centuries. And both of the essays read like very traditional essays, like something you would find in print, but both of them are taken to the next level through their inclusion of multimedia elements. And in Nazanin's, for example, if you scroll to the end of the essay, you get the catalog of the 18 Yadegari, the 18 surviving Yadegari that she has documented, and each has a photograph and a transcription, a translation in the English translation. And she very kindly also agreed to record her recitations of the Yadegari. And in the cases of them being Persian poetry, this is really, really powerful. It's really a way to kind of sit with these verses, to hear these verses, to bring them to life, and to remember the place of orality in the minds of the pilgrims. And many of these verses continue to resonate in Yadegari and to resonate amongst pilgrims to shrines. So that's very, very powerful. And in Mariam's, this was a very carefully designed essay with very clear sections. And throughout the piece, you'll notice that there are multimedia elements. So, for example, you can hear a man playing ney by a tomb. And this was so beautiful that it inspired the music that I commissioned for the project. And in one video, you can see the Khadem sweeping. In another, you can hear the sounds of Nime Shaban, the birthday of the 12th Imam. And then in one video, it's a quiet day, and you just hear the birds in the courtyard chirping. And it's such a good contrast. And these videos, again, help to bring the tomb to life. I mean, the only thing that we couldn't do really in multimedia is enable you to smell the Nazri, to smell the dishes being offered in the tomb during communal ceremonies. So together, these two pieces really, really resonated for me as I tried to better understand the shrine's meaning and resonance to its people over the centuries. And in addition to sharing so much important original scholarship, I just really love the way that the scholarship was presented. And this is thanks to the digital format, and also thanks to the fact that anything I wanted, that I felt the piece needed, as the editor, as the publisher, I could tell to our designer, Julia, and she could execute in the code. The distance between my vision as the editor, the needs of the piece, and the execution and the code was just seamless. There were very, very few hiccups. So this was quite special just in terms of creating these pieces. And I also want to draw your attention to some what I would call crowd favorites. These are in a different medium, and these are films. And these films help to achieve one of my central goals at the beginning, those disconnects that I mentioned between the shrine itself and between its displaced tiles and archives worldwide. And two of the most important films were done by Hamid Abhari, a member of our research team, and you can watch his film on Varamin in the Varamin Gallery, where he takes you around the city and to some very well-known sites and to some lesser-known sites. And then in the building gallery, you can watch his site tour, which is not only a tour of Emamzadeh Yahya complex, but also its neighborhood and some very important related spaces in the neighborhood of Kohnegel. And these two films together really make the words Varamin and Emamzadeh Yahya meaningful. And I feel like anyone who sees the tiles in London, in Doha, in St. Petersburg, if they watch his site tour, the shrine's name will not just go in one ear and out the other. Emamzadeh Yahya will now mean something, and it won't just be called the Varamin Shrine. It will have a place, it will have a setting. And I think that's a huge contribution. And Hamid also edited what I can say is truly one of my favorite pieces overall, which is the oral history with local scholar Agaya Mohammed Amini. And this was an interview led by Jabbar Rahmani, also a member of our research team, a religious anthropologist. And he did this with Mariam, a social anthropologist who I've also mentioned. And this is a wonderful interview where Agaya Amini shares the memories of Muharram from his childhood. And this is an important example of where a film, just because it's a film, doesn't mean it's less important, less scholarly. This film was actually one of the most challenging pieces to edit and to understand, because what the knowledge that he shared in his interview was local knowledge. It was challenging for us all to come to terms with the sites and the spaces that he mentioned. And to this day, I'm so glad that his voice and his face is really the strongest one in the website. And it's a real testament to his work and a real reminder of the importance of local knowledge. And I wish we could have done maybe 5 of these interviews, and we could have. So this is just a glimpse of his local knowledge. And on the flip side, we also did 3 films in museums. So the first 2 that I'll discuss are films that were dreams for me and things that I worked on with curators and archivists. The first one that you can find is in the Luster Gallery. And so this is a handling session with Fuchsia Hart at the V&A, where she handles some of the Star and Cross tiles, where she discusses their archives, and she takes us on a tour of their displays in the V&A. And I'm so happy we have this film because it's the V&A and the Hermitage that are most mentioned and most in the consciousness of people in and around the shrine itself. So this is a really nice way to get a better look at this incredibly important collection. And thanks to Fuchsia and the museum, there's been a generosity of sharing the materials, including the archives. And another really wonderful collaboration was with, it's in the museum gallery with Martina Masulo and Alejandra Tafur Manrique at the Louvre. And this focused on the Yeda and André Godard archive. And we can say that this is one of the most important archives of Iranian photography outside of Iran. And we did this film where Alejandra gives you a really nice view of the realities of archival storage of photography, of the material supports of photography, and then we zoom in on the Emamzadeh Yahya materials. And I think this film will also just be very useful to people who use photographs as a source and who perhaps need to be a little bit more precise about what they are talking about when they talk about a photograph. And then there's a third film that was kindly contributed by Nicoletta Fazio and the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. And this was quite nice because it shows their tiles, their Star and Cross tiles, most of which are in storage. And that is a collection that is closest to Iran. So these are just 2 examples of categories of favorites. But I would encourage every user to find your own, and ideally to find a favorite that maybe you hadn't anticipated maybe read or listen to or watch someone you didn't know about previously. And I think you'll find some surprises.
Given that time is running tight, I want to round up our discussion, which I must thank you really, because it's not just been insightful, but it's also been personal. And I think it's nice for an audience to hear about the people involved in a project like this, but also the people involved at the shrine, the place itself that is the object of study, really. One thing you've alluded to is this idea of multimedia, the fact that it's online on a website offers you ways to present information that aren't available on a piece of paper. What does a project like this mean for the museum as a broad idea? You mentioned earlier on about your previous experience in curation led you to some conclusions or ideas that have contributed to this project. And so to step back away from this project and think about future projects for yourself or for other people who may be interested in these sort of ways of thinking about how to present information, how does this fit into the museum and how we present information about the past and the present, online or not online today? Heavy question.
No, it's a great question. I think the main point to emphasize for your listeners about the physical museum is if we're talking about a physical museum or about something done in a museum, it's typically generated by that museum's mission and that museum's collections. And the history of those acquisitions might be quite dark, right? So when we're talking about something done by a museum, it's inherently tied to that museum and it's inherently driven by that collection, which can have major gaps, which can have strengths, weaknesses, etc. Someone once called this a virtual museum, and it made me realize that, okay, yeah, it is kind of like a virtual museum in the sense that it's acting like its own museum.
Mm.
There's one star of the show, it's the Emamzadeh Yahya. But what sets this project apart is that it's totally independent. There were many, many institutional collaborations in this project for funding, for research. But the project itself, at the end of the day, is totally independent and it's only accountable to the subject.
Mm-hmm.
That's our judge.
Yeah.
The shrine as an entity, as a conceptual entity, is the judge, right?
Mm-hmm.
We answer to the shrine and to its history and to try to bring out its many layers and identities. So I think what this project shows is that you can do an independent museological project in deep collaboration with museological partners.
Mm.
And that's very hopeful to me. So to give you an example, what do you think about when you think about the imperialist museums who have these tiles? Well, the Hermitage, the V&A, the Louvre.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some of the most useful, fruitful, productive partnerships in this project. But those collaborations were so productive, so transparent. They shared archives, they shared views and storage, they shared handling. And that's very, very important. And I think there's hope for these additional positive interactions. To give you one recent example, Hossein and I were finishing the piece on the mihrab when he was on a plane to Honolulu. We wanted to finish that piece before he landed so that our research was available, it was down, people could read it, could access it, and then he could have a hard discussion, right? So this was an example of the way that there were positive steps forward in conversations in terms of transparency. And I think that can be done at many more museums now.
Mm-hmm.
These conversations don't need to be accusatory. They don't need to be negative anymore. I think they can be positive. They can be productive. And there are a few holdouts, of course. But for the most part, every single curator and institution that I worked with in this project was wonderful. I think the museological interventions are positive. I think the publication interventions are equally important. So I'll just make a last pitch for that. We accepted contributions in Persian, 6 catalog entries, 1 oral history, 5 essays. We accepted them in Persian. We did not make Iranian authors write in English, because think about that. It makes no sense. People should be able to write in their best language. And when you're doing a project on an Iranian shrine, you should allow the people to whom that culture belongs to write in their own language.
Of course.
So we translated most of them. We had a fantastic translation team. It was one of the hardest, most labor-intensive parts of the project. All of it was done by human translators. This whole project was done by hand from scratch. So the interventions and who's included, in what language, how, giving people exposure in 2 languages, Mariam's essay, Nazanin's essay, Ahmad's essay, Mohammed Aminin's interview, they're all available in English. This is very, very important. Jabbar's catalog entries, we have catalog entries by the curator, retired at Astane Quds Razavi in Mashhad. Her catalog entries are in English. You know, it's very important to hear these voices. And these are voices who, by and large, have not been in the Euro-American centrist conversation. But this project actually is like truly rooted in a desire to capture diverse voices, to include people, it's rooted in a desire just to expand.
Wow.
And very thankful to everyone who contributed. So I hope some contributors will listen to this. And
I should add the URL is quite long, but it will be shared in the description of this podcast so that people can easily access and listen or browse as they listen as well. There's a lot to see.
That's great. Finally, I want to just say that it's the end of May, and anything I've shared here, I don't consider the final word. I'd really encourage people just to go to the website and let the website and the work speak for itself. Because we could have probably had 3 or 4 of these conversations.
Definitely. Well,
and
thank
finally,
you, Keelan.
thank you to Barakat. Thank you to Barakat. Thank you to you. Barakat's funding came in at such an important time. Barakat is the first place to recognize 33 Arches, which is my studio, the producer of this project. That was very meaningful to me. It sets a precedent for other independent scholars, and I'm eternally grateful for that, and grateful for the funding, grateful to all our other patrons, to our hosts, to our contributors, and everyone who participated in this very large project.
And thank you, Keelan, for sharing all of this today. I should say Emamzadeh Yahya has been, I suppose, the judge of many visitors in the past, and I suppose he'll be the judge of this project and of many future people visiting online or in person in the future. So thank you for bringing us together, for discussing, and look forward to seeing how the website continues to grow and develop and change.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Barakat Trust podcast.